Welcome to Sherlock Mondays. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we're going on a biblioventure through the stories of Sherlock Holmes. This is episode 2, A Study in Scarlet, part 2, The Country of the Saints. And joining me as co-host for this episode is Curtis Armstrong. Hi, Curtis.
Howdy. How are you, Ed?
I am great. Welcome to this biblioventure madness. We've gone on for several books now, and now we're finally getting to Sherlock, which I absolutely love. And
well, I'm glad to be a part of it.
It enables me to have great Sherlockians like you on the show. So thank you. What Curtis and I will be doing, everyone, is talking about Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes adventures. And for 30 weeks, we will deduce, decipher, dissect Doyle's stories about the world's first consulting detective, Sherlock Holmes, and his able assistant, Dr. John Watson. Able assistant, everybody. He's not the bumbling fool. It will be a kind of conversational annotation. The Rosenbach holds in its collections first editions of some of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes books, as well as the handwritten manuscript of The Adventure of the Empty House. If you are watching live right now, please like and subscribe the video and have fun in the live chat. That's for you guys to talk to each other and enjoy. If you are watching the recording, again, also, please like and subscribe. And I'd love for you to leave comments or questions in the comments field below the video, and we'll get back to you. This show is also an audio podcast this time, and every video episode that we do is going to drop as an audio podcast the following Monday. So today, the first episode has dropped. Look for it everywhere you get podcasts. And if you're listening to the podcast version, welcome. Thanks for tuning in, and leave us a review. You could also please consider making a donation to the Rosenbach, or by becoming a member. You could do this at our website, rosenbach.org. Your support helps us create programs like this and care for our collections. Sherlock Mondays is brought to you by the generous support of Lisa Washington. Thanks, Lisa. Let me introduce my illustrious co-host for this episode. Curtis Armstrong is an actor who began his life in the organized Sherlockian world when he joined the Trifling Monographs, a scion society for students founded by the late Susan Rice in the late 60s. His first paper was published in the Baker Street Journal shortly before his induction in the Baker Street Irregulars in 2006. He has delivered numerous papers since at the BSI annual January birthday weekends in New York City for the 221 Beacon in Atlanta, Georgia, as well as literary symposiums in Chicago and the Hudson Valley, New York. Recently, he was featured in both seasons. I haven't listened to this yet. There's so much I have to do. I can't wait to listen to it, though. He has been featured in both seasons of the Audible dramatic series Moriarty, written by Charles Kindinger. Curtis.
Yes.
You are a great Sherlockian, and I thank you for joining us. How I know in that brief intro, you were a student and you got in this group. But how did you discover Sherlock Holmes, and what led you to being so interested in it?
Well, it was in the early '60s, mid '60s, and there was nothing earth shattering about it. It was my parents had been transferred overseas in the mid '60s. We were living in Switzerland, and there was not a lot of television, or they were very strict on movies you could go to when you were under 16. It was a weird time. And so we wound up, I became a reader then. I never stopped. I never looked back. And my father had books, and he had a complete set of the Sherlock Holmes books, and he was the one who passed them on to me, and it started an obsession which has never stopped. And then later, when we returned to Detroit, I found out about the Baker Street Journal, and subsequently found out about Susan Rice's scion group, Trifling Monographs, which, lo and behold, I mean, you're reading the Baker Street Journal, you're reading about all of these wonderful things that are happening in New York and Philadelphia and all that. in London. But lo and behold, there was this science group that was being established for uh, students, and it was 20 minutes drive from my house in Detroit. So
Hmm.
um, I joined and was with them as long as I was in high school, and then everybody, of course, went off, started their lives, and that ended. But then I wound up meeting up with Susan again years later when I was working in the theater,
Hmm.
and that's how I started getting my introductions to. I was living in New York then, to the Baker Street Irregulars.
Yeah, and let me clarify this because I think someone commented last week's show that people think that, oh, it's a closed group kind of thing. The Baker Street Irregulars is the big group is invitation only to get like a name and to be able to go to the dinner, but then there's all the connected groups, all the sciences, and they're very open, and anybody can do this. I mean,
Right.
what's the famous Morley line that you only need to have a meeting, you only need two people in a bottle, and in a pinch you can do without the second person. I mean, it is anybody getting together to talk about Sherlock Holmes is a Sherlock group, and we're all very welcoming.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean that's evolved over time. At the time, for
Yeah.
example, when I was a member of Susan's group, Susan, who was our light, our guiding light and inspiration of a Sherlockian scholar, was not allowed to join the Baker Street Irregulars because she was a woman.
Yeah.
That all changed, uh, uh, but it even then took decades for that to change.
Yeah.
So, and there were still science groups, and I believe still are science groups, um, dotted around the country where women are not allowed, which is,
Yeah, it's only about one or two now, I think. So I was
yeah,
talking with somebody recently, and it's amazing that still is, but that still
the
is.
appeal is lost on me, but
Yeah,
that's just me.
that how anybody would restrict anybody to talk
Yeah,
about
I mean,
Sherlock.
yeah, that's,
But you were inducted in the as officially into the BSO. What is your name? What did they give you?
they gave me an actor and a rare one.
Ooh,
And
about
so,
that.
which was a description of Sherlock Holmes by one of the Scotland Yard detectives. He says, "You would have made an actor and a rare one."
That's
So
great.
someone had it before me. I can't remember. An actor had it before me, but
Do
you know, it's
you
like
ever?
it's like numbers on jerseys when you're part of a professional sports team.
Mhm.
And this will be the only time I mention anything about sports. That when you resign from the team, your number is passed on to someone else. At least one other actor had it before me.
Good. Um, it is appropriate that you're doing the second part of Study in Scarlet, where we go to the Utah desert. Another Sherlockian, Susan Dowager, recently told me about a time that she was at a Baker Street Irregular trip in Utah, that you were also there.
That's
Um,
right.
she also said that that you guys discovered it wasn't entirely a dry state, and you found
Well, yeah,
you found a
yeah.
place.
We were we just I was doing. I believe I did a paper there. I delivered a paper there. No, I didn't deliver a paper there. The reason I was there was, in the first place, I wanted to be a part of the Baker Street Irregulars, and they had these trips. They've done three now. I think they did the one to Pennsylvania for Valley of Fear. They did the one to Utah for Study in Scarlet, and they did one, I believe, in New York State. Um, and so they do this. It's a 3 day symposium, which is separate from the birthday weekend, which we all go to.
Mhm.
And in this case, I don't know how we get to this exactly within this discussion, but it had been arranged that there had been a publication through the Baker Street Irregular Press of Doyle's apparently lost play, Angels of Darkness, which was the play that it's basically the Mormon section of Study in Scarlet in a play version
that he wrote.
that
Even
he wrote.
early
And
on too, right? Did he write it just after he had published Scarlet?
it was some time after he had started it. There are letters in the Life and Letters that John
Lellenberg, yeah,
put together. There are letters that reference it, and in fact, the letters that they found, or Charles Foley, I think might have been the co-editor of that the letters that they found were him saying in so many words, I have used the story from Study in Scarlet for this project. It was never produced, and they finally found it at some point, and it's pretty dreadful. It's actually would be unproducible today, if only because of the hair-raising racism in this play, which just goes beyond the pale.
Hmm.
And it's also, frankly, I mean, you get into the anti-Mormonism and the Asian racism and the black racism, and Dr. Of course, Holmes does not appear. Dr. Watson appears in this as a character, but it's obviously not a canonical depiction of Dr. Watson, because what would he have been doing in Utah years before he ever met Sherlock? But so it was, but what they arranged to do was there was a local amateur theater there in Salt Lake City, which we renamed the Danite Players in honor of the book and the Dan. They were was a subset of the an extremist subset, as I understand it. I am not an expert, but I believe that the Dans were Danite, short for Danite, that they were an extremist wing of the Mormon Party, and they were sort of the ones that Doyle was sort of using as a representation of Mormonism as a whole.
We'll get into that a little bit later, the kind of sources that he found.
So we they had costumes and all of that, and one of the irregulars, Paul Singleton, who is an actor, had done an edit of the play, so it was not the complete play, and he was unable to attend at the last minute, so I wound up playing Dr. Watson and directing, which literally we had, half an hour.
There you go. How long does it take to put on a play? Much time as you have.
Yeah, exactly. And so we did a performance of it, which counts, I guess, as the world premiere of the Angels of Darkness.
All right. Wow. How was it received? I mean, did the edit also make it a little more palatable?
Well, it made it shorter, and that made it more palatable.
Okay.
It was, yeah. I mean, it was. People were there not to be entertained, which was a good thing. They were there to see something performed by Conan Doyle, which had never been seen performed before. I mean, it was historic from that standpoint. There's not much you could do to really save this. I mean, it wouldn't open on Broadway. But it was, from an historic sort of bibliographic perspective, it was interesting.
It is amazing. This just came up on I do another show called Pickwick Monthly, where we go through the Pickwick Papers once a month, and by Charles Dickens. It's amazing because Dickens tried to write plays. It seems so common that like the writers from the 19th century who we think are great now, so many of them tried their hand at drama and they were all terrible.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, they all did it, and they all wrote poetry, and that
Mhm.
was usually terrible as well. But as professional writers, this is what their job was.
Yeah.
They weren't, I mean, in a weird way, they weren't thinking in terms of how their whole oeuvre would be judged in the future. But these were all people who had a lot, in some ways, a lot greater uh, uh, options to explore. They were, constantly writing things in order to keep going and pay the bills. That's all what they were doing. And Doyle famously wrote an adaptation the Speckled Band,
Yeah.
I think, which he had written to save a failed play that he had already put up in the West End,
Mhm.
that he threw together basically, because he had the rent on the theater. So they wrote poetry, they wrote articles, they wrote, they lectured, they did all of these things because that's what they did in order to keep the money coming in. So
Yes.
it wasn't. I don't think they ever questioned whether they were competent playwrights. You put Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes up on a theater, and people came flocking,
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
not.
Well, before we get to the story, we also have specialty cocktails for each show. Sherlock-tails. They were created by one of our co-hosts, Mary Alcaro, who will join me on a later episode. And this week's Sherlock-tail is the Mormon section. This Mormon-friendly recipe is not a hot drink and contains no alcohol or caffeine, with a wink. It is cranberry juice or cocktail, a little bit of soda. There is an optional secret non-Mormon approved vodka garnished with a lime. Um, I will tell you the absolute truth. I do not have any secret vodka in my Sherlock-tail
Well,
because it's
and
gin. Because it's gin. Because that's how I spell vodka. But
oh, well,
but
okay.
we'll keep it a secret.
Well, I have a bit of a surprise in this department. With apologies to Mary, I did not make the
The Mormon section.
Mormon cocktail this morning, evening. What I did do was this.
Postum.
That Postum. Now, the story with Postum is my grandmother introduced me to Postum, um, and it is an instant cereal beverage,
Mm-hmm.
and became famous as what Mormons drank instead of coffee or tea, because that had.
Yeah. And is a
So
postum kind of invented as a replacement for.
exactly. And then in World War II, when World War II came along and the coffee and tea were in short supply because of the war, suddenly it became extremely popular um, in the US. And that was when my grandmother started drinking it. And I was raised drinking this stuff,
Wow.
which most of my the people I've introduced it to claim that it tastes like dirt. I don't feel that way. I think it tastes quite lovely
Well,
after.
you were raised on it, so it's the taste of your.
Well, I mean, it's a thing for after dinner that I do, or in the morning. In this case, I would normally drink coffee or tea, but since we're doing this, I made a special
How
treat,
about that? There you go.
and so now I'm
Mormon,
having
your Mormon approved beverage.
exactly. I'll
Well,
bet you weren't expecting that.
I was not expecting postum.
Ooh,
Nobody expects postum.
no.
You can find the recipe for the Mormon section in the YouTube description of this episode. And I also send the recipe out via email every week for those who are registered for the show. You can register for Sherlock Mondays at our homepage on rosenbach.org. We've also shared a PDF of a facsimile of Study in Scarlet as it was originally published in Beeton's Christmas Annual in 1887. You can download that on the Rosenbach's Sherlock Mondays page. And I say that especially if you're listening to the audio podcast, that's where you can find the illustrations that we'll look at in every episode. Okay. Last week, we had a little intro to Doyle writing his story. And I wanted to ask you before we got started, Curtis, because, I mean, it is the first part of this is the Sherlock Watson origin story and like introduction to his method and all his quirks and things like that. And I just wanted to get some thoughts from you on the very first Sherlock and Watson meeting and all of that in part one.
Well, I mean, it always has amazed. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, because it amazes me reading it again for the countless times I've read this book, and sort of astonished at the way the first section leading up to the Mormon flashback is full-fledged, fully formed, classic Sherlock Holmes, fully formed out of the forehead of Zeus, or whatever the expression is. It's astonishing that he had this that just came out. It amazes me every time. It's like the best television pilot ever not seen. There are no questions left unanswered. The Watson, because he's describing it, gives his story, and it's got some adventure in it and some excitement in it, and now he's at this point in his life where there's something ahead of him, but he doesn't know what. He talks about being, winding up in London, that great cesspool into which all the loungers of the empire are irresistibly drained. How he's on a veteran's pay, and he's spending too much money, and there's a bit of sort of code about, well, is he drinking too much? Is he, he meets people in bars, but he's on a fixed income, and is he gambling, which is we find out later is a bit of a thing for him. So he's at a point where he's pretty close to rock bottom.
Yeah.
And that's where he meets Stamford, young Stamford, a dresser under him at Bart's. And Stamford is the one who introduces him to Sherlock Holmes. And the world shifts.
Yeah. Well,
not just for him, but for all of us.
But and it's interesting because the word only shifts because afterwards Doyle's is talking to do it and more of them. And the kind of what I find fascinating is he's not writing this as I'm starting a series.
No.
He's writing this as a standalone. So he doesn't intend for any of this stuff to go on later. And so I'm really interested in how these characters exist now, and are they any different than what he will develop them later, especially Watson, because Watson's so frail. He constantly talks about how weak and nervous he is because of his injury.
Right.
Completely.
Yeah. Well, I think it's one of the things that's so interesting about it, and I don't know that any of us have a real sense of how much Doyle was aware of what he was doing and what his depiction of Watson is so human.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes the character of Sherlock Holmes more mysterious, and you are basically revealed. Holmes becomes revealed by peeling away layers, and the fact that Watson is so unaware of who this man is and even what he does, who his relatives are, is a complete cipher. And as Watson says at one point in studying Scarlet, as someone who was unable to get around because of his wound and the weather was bad and he didn't, so he was there, he had no friends. So he's sitting around the rooms in Baker Street all day, focusing on this guy who he is too shy to ask direct questions about as a Victorian male.
Mm-hmm.
That he is just trying to put together who he is, and he makes his famous list of Holmes's limits and all of that, trying to find out who he is. And then by the time the Lauriston Gardens murders take place, and Holmes takes him along, his life becomes different. He has no way of knowing how different it's going to be. The future is still closed to him, but it's interesting to watch it develop at that point. Holmes develops as you go on. Next story, you find out about the drug addiction. In this story, his according to Watson, there's no way that he could be addicted to drugs, even though he seemed like it from time to time, because Holmes didn't feel comfortable revealing that side of himself to this stranger.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that I love in particular, where Watson says something which we never actually hear about the Copernican theory, and Holmes obviously is being bothered by this chatterbox who's talking about the Copernican theory with all of this, pseudoscientific air, and you can hear Holmes say, Copernican, no, I've never heard of it. What is it? It's like he just wants him to stop talking.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, stop telling me stories about, your battle, whatever it is that he's talking about. And Watson, because he doesn't know this man yet, thinks he really doesn't know what the Copernican theory is.
Yeah.
Obviously, he knows what the Copernican theory is. But those are the kinds of little glimmers we get about these characters. And those are the kinds of things that just keep developing over time.
And also as you mentioned, like just kind of developing Watson or creating Watson as this character for Doyle. This is kind of a departure from, say, like the Edgar Allan Poe Dupin model, in which the narrator is the complete cipher. Nothing about Dupin's companion, pretty much. Well, a little bit, but not like this. And Doyle is creating a character that we can relate to go along with him.
When you read the Poe stories, you become, they were obviously written first, and Doyle was influenced to a degree by them.
Always acknowledge that, yeah.
But he always did. But the truth is, what you find in the Poe stories is Dupin, this extraordinary, brilliant, unique character. But there's no bridge to that character for us as readers. You can stand. That's why there's no connection to us because these are being narrated by someone who is present and who knows Dupin and lives with Dupin. I think. But if you don't have that person to be a translator in a way, then all you can do is admire the brilliance of this guy from a distance.
Yeah.
Which is a way to go, but certainly it's where Doyle improved upon the model.
Absolutely. Well, let's get started. The part 2, The Country of the Saints. I know before we get started, that's a mantra of mine before we get started. You mentioned that how it's kind of a complete story. It just needs a little wrap up. But no, Doyle's like, I guess he feels compelled to also write an American Western adventure story that I'm just going to stick in here. That's kind of the backstory for the murderer. Doesn't have Watson narrate it. It's like third person omniscient. And it really does seem out of place.
Well, there are a couple things going on here. One is what Doyle was doing, and the other is, from a Sherlockian standpoint, what the game that we play when we talk about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson as being real people, Watson being the actual narrator, and so on and so forth as characters. So what happens in Study in Scarlet is curious. A nice word for it in some cases. So what happens is, from Doyle's standpoint, Doyle is trying to sell a novella to be published, ideally in an annual. I don't think at that point he's being paid by the word. It's just, he's just finding something that he can, interest publishers to do, so he can make some money. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And he could very well have done the whole first section with Sherlock Holmes, with the murder and the investigation and the capture of Jefferson Hope. All of those things could have happened, and you could have then, wrapped it up with as he does, with Holmes sitting there explaining to Watson, and Watson going, "Great Scott, this extraordinary thing. How did you do it?" He's saying, "Well, that was obvious." But so that whole section, no one would have missed the Mormon section. No one would have read that version of Study in Scarlet, which, by the way, if you go to Christopher Morley's book, the first annotated Sherlock Holmes collection, which is called Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, a textbook of friendship.
Mm-hmm. On my shelf back here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
This one.
Yeah, that's the one. So what Morley did there, and Morley being not only a bookman but one of the founders of the Baker Street Irregulars, even he was conscious of the fact that the Mormon section of this book is a bridge too far for some readers. It's a rough patch to get through the first time. It's a shock.
Yeah.
But from Doyle's standpoint, what he is thinking is, if I put something, fill this story in, make it novella length, although that wasn't a phrase I think was used at the time, but make it novella length and transport the reader to an exotic, unknown place, the American West, and this cult, as it was considered in Britain at the time, especially, which he was able to tart up as being even more insidious. This was all very much. This was all well-trod material when it came to the Mormons stealing British housemaids and taking them to America and making them parts of their harem and all of that.
Yeah.
Sort of. That was something that was happening. It was part of the 19th century idea at the time.
What they believed was going on.
These are more people who are coming to take our servants away.
Yeah.
Or our young women who don't know any better. So that was all something that he didn't even really need to introduce.
Yeah.
It was already in the British consciousness. But what it did for him as a writer is he was able to sell something to Beeton's Christmas Annual that would be not just a new detective story with a new detective and his associate, but also this extraordinarily weird flashback story about this foreign, distant land. And
there's a love story in it, and that's got to really help selling a story.
But the love story winds up becoming complicated because within 2 chapters the love story is basically done.
It's a tragic love story.
How do they get away? and then they don't get away, and you never see her again. She dies,
Yeah.
and then the rest of this story is Jefferson Hope traipsing around the world, following these
Yeah.
two horrible men.
Romeo didn't kill himself. Instead, he got revenge on everybody for Juliet.
Yeah, exactly. And so it becomes a revenge tale.
Yeah.
So it's a mixture. You can really see, if you try to put yourself in the reader's uh, uh, easy chair from the day, what they have in front of them at the Beaton's Christmas Annual is a story which is a detective story, modern, and it's a Western thriller. Again, a word they would not have used probably, but that's what it was. And a love story that becomes a revenge story. And I mean, it's
Wrapped inside a detective story.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
It's packed.
Yeah.
And now that doesn't alter the fact that from a modern reader's perspective, The Country of the Saints is a slog. And the thing that amazes me about it now is rereading it again, as I did before we started talking. It's really short.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels as you're reading it like it's taking as long as it took them to get from Illinois to Utah. It's actually about what, 4 or 5 chapters, something like that, and
5 chapters.
several of them are very
Yeah.
short. And it's just so dated that your mind is sort of boggled.
Yeah.
That there is a little girl who actually says, "Then Mummy's a deader too." I mean, deader. I've not done the research, but the idea of referring to somebody who has died as a deader sounds like something that was invented by somebody who said, well, they've got to talk differently than we do.
Yeah.
So I'll just make up that it sounds like something a little girl would say, which it doesn't. So there are certain things that jump out at you about the Country of the Saints, like that, individual things like that, which are just really bad. And then when you take the time to read it carefully, what you see is that there is almost not a single line of believable dialogue in the entire piece, from beginning to end. It's just dated to the point that it's dazzling.
It's a bit like Bram Stoker and trying to make a Western character, and Quincy Morris, and he speaks these ridiculous,
in a way, but that's wrapped into the story with other, totally believable characters given the type of book it is. So yeah, I mean, it's that well, Missy, I don't know. I think I'll hop on my have to get through these cows. If those cows had jumped on me, he wouldn't have known what to do. Those old cows. I mean, it's pretty difficult. Now, having said that, I don't believe in skipping the Mormon section because it's dated and for me, it's short enough that there is always a kind of dark fascination that comes from reading this section, that can be seen on different levels. The primary one being, I mean, one of the things that have been pointed out about Country of the Saints is how this story came to be at all. Mm-hmm. Within the world of Holmes and Watson, where did this story come from? Because Jefferson Hope is dead.
Yeah.
He didn't keep a novel about his life and how he lost Lucy Ferrier and what he did, all of these things are pieced together. Holmes gets some of them from Cleveland, from the policeman in Cleveland. Some of them come out during Jefferson Hope's narration at the at the end, his confession to the Scotland Yard detectives. Some of it comes out there. The detail that goes into the whole thing, that third person storytelling, which is another jerk for people, is they're going first person and
Yeah.
this other third person narration. All of that stuff came from somewhere, but we never really know where it came from.
The text doesn't explain to you. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, there are different theories about it, but the main one, the only one that makes sense to me, is the one that I believe is true in all of the third person narrations throughout the canon, which is they were all written by Watson. The reason that the Sherlock Holmes sections work brilliantly is because he was writing them when they were happening, and they're about him and his life. This is something that he's just making up out of whole cloth, and he does the best he can with it, and he makes the dialogue sound weird because that's how they would think it would sound to English Victorian ears. But it was just his way of filling in the narration, which was otherwise not that clear.
Well, let's get to the beginning of it then, because what's interesting to me is the way it starts on the Great Alkali Plain. Is that this description of America, while there are deserts and stretches there, this is a fantasy land description of Doyle's impression of the frontier of America.
Right.
Now, there were early atlases that did have this giant swath as like a desert, and it's not. I mean, there were plains and different areas within there. So Doyle's got that going in, but I like the way he's using this landscape as a mood that will continue through this part of the story. And it's this land of desolation. And these are some of his words: desolation and silence, dark, gloomy, barrenness, inhospitable, misery.
Yeah.
And this is what he's trying to get across, even though we can look at it and say, like, this isn't really a place that exists. Or you've gotten the geography wrong here and there. It is exactly the place that he wants to create for these characters.
Sure, of course. And another funny thing about this book is there is a strangely cinematic quality to In the Country of the Saints that works tremendously well visually. And if you read it with an eye to that, and believe me, when you've read it as many times as I have, you try to find more and more reasons to read it from a different perspective, because it's not the easiest thing to get through. So look at it from the standpoint of this is a visual representation of this land, Sierra Blanco, which I think is even wrong. Shouldn't it be Sierra Blanca?
Yeah, it should be.
Anyway, whatever it is. That idea, when you see, it's a reversed close-up of this land where you see there's nothing. Even the Indians don't go there. It picks up the vultures as the heavy birds are flapping towards this place where there are these two figures, or this sole figure at that point, of John Ferrier there. And, the camera it's like it's coming in from, a great distance. And then you wind up here and you see this man obviously on his last legs, and he's falling asleep. And then the next thing you know is the chosen, the Mormons coming across the desert, in this, they say nigh on 10,000, which sounds great.
It was like 100. It was like 140 or something like that.
I think it was 900 according to Brigham Young, and he was probably, inflating it. But you know, whatever it is, it's this group of people coming. And so there's something about the way that it's described, which is intensely visual from somebody who, if you watch movies or make movies, you can see how this would work really well.
Even before we get the, well, after, actually, when we get the swoop in, then what we get is Lucy Ferrier acting like a little Nell in the way she's, did God make this country?
It's actually it's actually not bad dialogue at that point, because she said, does God make this country? Did he make did he make this country too? And
Yeah.
he said, well, I reckon he did. And she said, well, I don't think he worked as hard here.
Yeah. I guess somebody else made the country in these parts. It's not nearly
Yes,
so well done. They forgot the water and the trees. That's a funny
exactly.
line.
I mean, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's the last of it though.
Yeah, because she's, I'm happy to die because I'm going to be with mother, and
She'll meet his,
that's the real little
date
now
with
stuff
hot
there.
kids. I mean, it's really not great writing, but that's okay. It's what it was at the time,
All right, let me take a small break in our discussion of this to tell everyone to learn more about the Rosenbach. You can visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online programs and courses, and always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections, which anyone can do. Our holdings are always accessible to researchers who make a free appointment to visit our reading room. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you'll consider supporting the Rosenbach and Sherlock Mondays by donation, which you can do at our website, or by becoming a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website, and Rosenbach membership makes a great gift. We have so many members from all over the world now. Thanks to all of you who have already donated and joined our endeavors. You can also join us on the Facebook group page Sherlock Mondays for lots more Sherlockian info, news, links, conversation, and fun. And as I mentioned, there's also an audio podcast version of this show. Look for the Rosenbach podcast, Sherlock Mondays, on wherever you get your podcasts. The podcasts drop 1 week after these videos air. And you can always write to me at epettit@rosenbach.org. I love to hear from our audience, and I heard from so many of you after the first show, which was great. Thanks for all the good words about the show. There are lots of great programs and reading courses coming up at the Rosenbach, online and in person. Online courses on historical topics and great books. In person, behind the bookcase presentations about our collections. You can always visit the Rosenbach in person to see our exhibitions or tour the historic house. Find out more at rosenbach.org. And finally, when Sherlock Mondays comes to a close with the adventure of the empty house, not till next year, we have one more Sherlockian biblio venture to take you on. We're having an exclusive pay-only series on the Hound of the Baskervilles. It will be 8 episodes available by paid subscription only that will run on Mondays in May and June. Same format, myself and other special co-hosts taking you to Dartmoor this time, where a strange diabolical hound haunts the moors, preying upon the heirs of Baskerville Hall. What will the logically reasoning Sherlock Holmes do when faced with a supernatural creature? You really don't want to miss that one. Registration is not yet open. Stay tuned in the coming weeks. We will let you know when you can register. Back to the country of the saints. Well, Lucy and John lay down to die, but the Mormons come and save them. And then Ferrier has to promise them that he will adhere to the Mormon faith in order to go with them, which is probably the first moment. I mean, not only the numbers are exaggerated by Doyle, but the fact that that's not even historically accurate for Mormons and when they were found. They didn't force people to join them, and they wouldn't have left him to die, I imagine, out in the desert if he didn't become a Mormon. There's also an illustration too, because I always like to feature the illustrations here of when they are saved, and it is this D.H. Friston. Here it is. Had done that. Well, there it is. They're hoisting Lucy up on their shoulders, and they're helping, John Ferrier here. It's kind of, I mean, there's only a couple of illustrations for studying Scarlet, and they're nothing like the wonderful Paget illustrations that'll happen in the Strand later.
No, but again, these are illustrations for another world, really. I mean, this is, these are very much, I think, typical sort of late Victorian illustrations for popular magazines, and we look at the D.H. Friston depiction of Holmes and Watson, and you just can't even believe it's so wrong. Well, it's not that it was so wrong, it's that Paget and Dorr Steele and the rest of them all got it so right. They approached it in a different way. They were producing material for different audiences. The difference between something like Beeton's Christmas Annual and the Strand magazine, it's like different universes. And so this is, probably pretty typical of the time.
This is a very melodramatic, very Victorian, especially we're taking care of the elders, but we're really valorizing the young children, the innocence of youth, this whole creation of childhood is this, innocent paradise, at the time for the Victorians.
Exactly. Yeah. They're in this world, which isn't strictly speaking the American West that he's proposing it is, and the Mormons, who are not really the crazy cult that, here's the thing, is that he never goes into the history of the Mormon religion or anything like that. But you go into it even a little bit, and you see there are things about it that are certainly unusual, but probably not that much more unusual than the idea of the Great Flood, where Noah puts two animals of every animal on the planet. I mean, all religions have origin stories that are a little funny, because that's not why they're there, is to be believable. But what they did in these kinds of stories was to depict, out of necessity, Doyle had to depict the Mormons as, psychotic, practically, people. In order for there to be the tension that he needed for, and already, as I said previously, there was already a lot of suspicion gathering around the Mormons in Britain. Suspicion, I should say, prejudice, deep.
Let's get to that. But first, it's John Ferrier and Lucy become, they get taken in. They become kind of very successful, or Ferrier becomes very successful in the town, and Lucy becomes a woman. The men start looking at her, and then she meets Jefferson Hope and
Flower of Utah.
Yes, and they're immediately, in love with each other. Jefferson Hope, though, his love is volcanic, wild, fierce, tempestuous. I mean, he's the American frontiersman, uncivilized but noble, and they're promised together. And then we get into Ferrier then talks with the prophet, talks with Brigham Young. I think even that word prophet there is a kind of red flag for the Victorian reader, for the usual Christian in the Victorian age to think that, like, someone's not like, he's not a prophet, prophets are, you know, from the Bible, from the Old Testament. He couldn't possibly be one. And but the big, and Ferrier's not a fan of the Mormon marriage because it's
Oh no.
polygamous, and he gets that, and that's that idea of Morgan polygamy in the Victorian age that is the thing that Victorians were most fascinated with, especially British Victorians, and also most horrified by, that they would be these multiple wives.
Right. Well, I mean, there had to have been an element of titillation to it as well.
Yeah.
You know, it was horrifying, it was appalling, but it was also kind of, I think, you know, titillating.
Yeah, and in that kind of repressed Victorian way, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
they want to hear that story.
Yeah.
They also Doyle also uses the word white slavers, and that's kind of a code for not white people becoming not necessarily the slavers themselves, but it's that kind of code for they're taking our women.
Well, it's not just code. I mean, he goes into a thing in the story where suddenly women are disappearing. Women, Gentile women, as they refer to them, are disappearing, and suddenly strange women are showing up in the harems of the Mormon elders, weeping and showing on their faces looks of unextinguishable horror. That they've been on their way somewhere with their husbands or families, and they were killed, and the women were taken and turned into, harem fodder.
Yeah. And
so I mean, it's out there. I mean, it's
in a culture where women already have no power, something like polygamy is really dangerous. And that is, we've always seen that.
And the funny thing is, he has Brigham Young in that conversation with John Ferrier. Brigham Young is saying, but of course, we would not deprive her of all choice.
Yeah.
Which, there's a modern connection to that, which it makes me smile every time. But he says, obviously, she can pick between these two.
She can pick if she wants to be a heifer too.
She can marry this one or she can marry this one. And
first, the women's
that's by way of giving her choice.
Yeah. Yeah, women are referred to as cows, and then Doyle even gives heifers. And Doyle even gives is that where Doyle gives the little footnote?
Yeah.
Saying that, like, it's actually true. This was actually said by one of them.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting, I always thought that was interesting and strange. He's quoting, I think his name is Herbert Kimball, who was an elder in the church, who referred to women, in Doyle's words, under this endearing epithet. And it's just this one, it may be the only footnote in Doyle's book, is the fact that women were referred to as heifers. And that was a way, I guess, for modern readers of signaling just how contemptible.
Yeah. And the sarcasm of this endearing epithet.
Yes.
You'll find sarcasm. You rarely find sarcasm in footnotes.
Exactly.
So, someone asked me this question before we wanted us to get into this, and it's just a matter of, there were lots of accounts in the 19th century, as especially as the last half of it, that the Victorian readers in England especially were reading about Mormons. Artemus Ward had written a book and then did a lecture tour on it, and he was mainly known as this comic, kind of like an early Mark Twain in a sense. Right. And who would do these routines and write comic things, but his lectures were sometimes kind of serious, that he was, really explaining to people who they were, and they really are. It's like they're describing someone who is very othered, who doesn't like, can you believe how crazy these Mormons are? And that was the idea, that they were
Right.
really perpetuating and people were living under all the time. No one reading this, I mean, some people, maybe this is the first time they saw it, but most people had heard of this and had heard of Mormonism, and they were just not surprised by the depiction that Doyle gives them, which is
No.
that that's how deep, that's how pervasive the prejudice was
Right.
about this new faith coming up. Well, the when Ferrier then decides he's going to go against them, and he's not going to choose, he brings up then we get the evil secret society, the avenging angels that they're going to have to, go up against, and it's like it's like there's some kind of criminal band from London, that like Sherlock would have to fight the avenging
Right.
angels. They're more like savage men of the Wild West than they are a religious group, and I think, especially as I think there's empire considerations here, just as we've seen in part one, the whole idea of Doyle challenging the benefits of empire. This is also a little empire being created by this group of people, and they of course also have their fanatics, that the British Empire is usually kind of radicalized religious fanatics, the kind of thing that still exists, that kind of.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that was the thing with the Danite
Yeah.
band, um, as they call it. The idea that these were the ones who were ambushing wagon trains and
Yeah.
stealing women and shooting men uh, and that sort of thing. And they were the ones, presumably. Well, I mean, Drebber and Stangerson both were part of the mob that tracked down Jefferson Hope and John and Lucy in the woods, in the desert, and murdered Ferrier.
They murder Ferrier and take Lucy.
And take Lucy.
I mean, they're terrorized by them at first.
Well, I mean, that's it's every religion has an extremist wing. They all do, and there's some element, or in history there was always some element of, when they get to a certain level, they become, bloodthirsty criminals.
And if you can't find the historical account to back you up, you can do what Doyle did and make things up.
Make it up. And what he's doing in this story is he's creating a religion which is based in terrorism. These are domestic terrorists.
Yeah.
As they are depicted once they are established in Salt Lake City. That's what they become.
They kill Ferrier, they take Lucy. Hope, is too late to save her. And his name too, Jefferson Hope, the Thomas Jefferson American part, and then he's Hope, but he's a savage wild man. He's a frontiersman guy. I love that he's given him this name, Doyle has. He comes too late, but he takes her ring. And then which is odd, because that's not the ring it's not like a ring he gave her. Why does
there's some big questions there too. Yeah.
But he then follows Strangerson is the one who shot John Ferrier, and Drebber is the one who winds up getting Lucy to marry him, and then she dies because she had to marry this man, so she just kind of wastes away herself. And then Hope chases them, Cleveland, and then they escape, and then he follows them to
St. Petersburg.
Yeah. And then finally London, and then,
I mean, all of that section of the story is covered over pretty quickly. So that when he is in Cleveland,
I would have been more interested in that story.
I mean, the whole thing is very convenient, that he happens to see Drebber in the street, and happens to, what are the odds of that? That you have, you somehow that he's in Cleveland, so you go there and you happen to see him. The odds are pretty remarkable.
Well, and then in London to come across him. one of the biggest, most populous cities in the world.
Exactly. So all of that has to be taken with a grain of salt. But again, that's why you tend to think if anybody wrote this stuff, it would have been Watson trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear with this story, which it needs to be there in order to fill out the narrative, and so that's what he did.
Well, on the on defending that, if anybody's going to find them, it's going to be a cabbie. If anybody's going to find a traveler, it's going to be a cabbie. And
Well,
so
yeah, and
right,
but I mean, what he was as a tracker in the Sierra Blanca doesn't really prepare him for being a cabbie in London.
He doesn't even have Toby. So
so
all right. Well, this is when we get back to that it ends there, and we get back to chapter 6 as a continuation of the reminiscences of John Watson. The text tells us what's going on, right? The text says at the beginning, part 1 is the reminiscences of Watson.
Right.
Then you get to part 2, and it just is the country of the saints. And then one of the chapters says, now we're back to Watson's, journals.
Right.
For his story.
We already
recounting this.
so much.
And it's right back to where they arrested him.
Yeah. An amazingly long flashback. And then suddenly, the end part of it, that last chapter of the country of the saints, is where everything is becoming it's starting to move faster and faster.
Year passed into year.
The narrator is now speeding to the point where we get back to Holmes and Watson and find out, actually meet him and hear everything out of his own mouth. And what I found interesting, believe me, it sounds weird. I've been reading Sherlock Holmes, including this book, since my teen years. And believe it or not, even in this, I find things now that I hadn't noticed before. And in this case, I noticed that once they, have him, Lestrade and Gregson are there, and they've got him trapped, and he's bleeding all over the place, and they're taking him into the police department, and they realize, Watson reveals that this man could die in minutes. And so they don't have time to get him a lawyer, and they say, okay, you give us your story and we'll take it down and we'll use it against you. And so then comes this long narration, not long, but a narration where you hear what you've just seen, basically out of Hope's own mouth in his words. And the interesting thing about it is, if you look at the way he talks in the story, in the Country of the Saints, it's like everyone else. He talks like a cowpoke, and, this volcanic, passionate man. And once he's sitting there with them, drinking water and telling them what happened to him, he talks, except for an occasional colloquialism, he talks throughout, not that dissimilarly than, Watson would, if he were telling the story. It's an interesting thing. All of that far west slang disappears.
Yeah.
And he just is now telling you the story.
Yep.
And it makes it a lot easier to read. And it makes it easier, more than ever, you realize how nice it would have been if there had been some way that Watson could have described this, rather than to have it be the third person.
Well, he doesn't want to be remembered as a common cutthroat. And this is where we get a kind of change here, because this story was about catching a murderer. And now once he's caught and he tells the story about how, the men he killed were guilty of the death of two human beings, a father and a daughter. He says it was impossible for me to secure a conviction against them in any court. I should be judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. You'd
Right.
have done the same if you had any manhood in you, if you had been in my place.
Mhm.
And that movement now from they were searching for a criminal, and Hope's like, yeah, but I'm not a criminal. And he's kind of right.
Well, see, I see it a different way. I don't see it that way at all. I see what happens in that chapter where he relates his story. There are a lot of questions about his aneurysm, his aortic
Yeah,
aneurysm,
aortic aneurysm, which is going to kill
and
him at any time. He could just die.
kill him at any time. Well, according to some people who have studied this, um, that is most likely due to end stage syphilis. And uh, another thing that can contribute to that condition is um, hallucinations. And one of the things, when I was reading it this time, just looking at this as, his account is he keeps talking about seeing them,
Yep.
seeing John and
They're
Lucy.
leading him literally along.
He's driving Drebber
Yeah.
or Stangerson in his cab, and he sees their faces.
Yeah.
Again, that's a very visual, cinematic. It wouldn't have been it at the time, but we can see it that way now. And then, he sees them as he's leading him, as he's dragging him into the house where he's going to kill him. They are walking ahead of him. And he says, I'm not kidding. They were there.
Mm-hmm.
They were really there with me. And the more you shift your perspective slightly about Jefferson Hope, the more you think this man was crazy. And when he says his aortic aneurysm was due to underfeeding and overexposure in the mountains, it's whether it was syphilis or that or whatever. The point is, he's not a well person. You realize that he has spent decades
Yeah.
following these men all over the world to kill them.
He's obsessed. It's that monomania that like
Exactly.
Poe, characters suffer from. But I would shift my perspective and into being a reader in 1887, and at a time in the Victorian age when people believe in spirits coming back to help us, and that happens all the time. Of course, the spirits are talking to us and they're help guiding us, and it's our loved ones. And here's Ferrier kind of confirming that for, I think, some people reading it, they would think that's not a hallucination.
Well,
That's something that the spirits do for us.
yeah, but I think you're probably, even then, you're a little limited to the numbers of people who would actually believe that. I think there's a difference between these spirits with him as he's ending this quest by killing these two men, and a spiritualist encounter where you're sitting with a medium and you're going through all of the things where spirits, which is another aspect of Doyle's character. This feels more to me like just somebody who's talking crazy.
Yeah.
If you try, if you put down Jefferson Hope's account of what happened after he got to London, you will find how really there are a lot of red flags just in the way he's describing it.
Does that then Adam had asked me a question about Hope as Jefferson Hope as a sympathetic character, in that is that something that kind of develops? And well, I kind of don't see him as a sympathetic character. I almost see him as what we realize at the end, is he's a character out to find justice, and he's monomaniacal in doing that, but that's what he's out to seek. But if it is the case that he's ill and hallucinating, that kind of does make him into a sympathetic character, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly, and even when you think about the
Or a
idea of
sympathetic
him,
criminal, I should say.
yeah, I mean, he's still, but you know, he plays that both ways too because of the
Mm,
way that he does it. He doesn't get these guys into a room and shoot them. He does this thing where he believes that God has allowed him to
yeah,
track them down, and not only that, God is going to make sure that when he holds those two pills out, though there, as he says, there's death in one and life in the other.
yeah,
And I mean, again, hugely dramatic moment when he does that with Stangerson. Uh, you know, in this room that's lit by candles, and you have this man who has spent his whole life tracking these guys down. He's bursting with blood. It's bloody. He is covered in his own blood
yeah.
because his heart is so full at this moment, and he holds that out and he says, take and eat. There is death in one and life in the other. I mean, it's undeniably dramatic
Yeah.
and thrilling. uh but it's, you don't do that. I mean, imagine what would happen if he'd gotten the pills wrong. You know, I mean, how irritating would that be after all of his, you know, tracking these guys? Damn, I picked the wrong pill. But he's so sure,
Yeah.
you know, that he's able to do that and take the other pill and not be worried.
I mean, it's interesting that the Cumberbatch Sherlock, the Moffat and Gatiss Sherlock turns that into like a serial killer, because that seems something like a crazy serial killer would do, that kind of method.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
they have to do it multiple times to reinforce that. But for Jefferson Hope in this story, this idea of Providence having a hand in life is
Yeah.
not as foreign to this audience, that audience then, as it is now, I think. And somebody had written asking me about that too, about the concept of Providence and the pills. And just the fact that he's on this mission of, you know, vengeance, and then at the end he's going to be like, well, I'll leave it up to this. Really? He's right in front of you.
Right. Yeah.
And for Hope, it's because he doesn't want to be the common killer. He wants to kind of give it
Yeah.
this shot.
He said-
And
he
you know,
says, "Who talks of murdering a mad dog?"
yeah,
That's one of the other lines
yeah,
that stands out in that section. Um, and these are lines unlike the ones in the that are, you know, littering the country of the saints.
mhm,
These are lines that are really great lines. I mean, in that kind of dramatic, over baked, melodramatic Victorian way, they're still really good lines. And when, you know, to say something like, when Stangerson says, "You would murder me," and he says, "No, I wouldn't murder you. Who talks of murdering a mad dog?" Um, uh, it's just, he does not come off as a well man. That's the truth. And um, and as Watson says, when they find him dead the next morning in his cell with a placid smile on his face, because he's accomplished his end, um, uh, that Watson says, he would not appear in the court. His case had been taken to a higher court where
higher judge.
strict justice would
Yeah,
be meted out to him,
a
which is
higher
actually another great line.
a higher judge had taken the matter in hand, and Jefferson Hope had been summoned before a tribunal where strict justice would be meted out to
I
him.
mean, that's a great line. And because it takes this, you know, religious sense that this guy had been driven to commit these crimes because he was sure that God was on his side, and now he was going to find out. No.
Yeah. I also like how he won't give up his accomplice, the one who dressed as the old woman. He's like, I'm not going to give him up. And that kind of like, That's
Yeah,
it.
I mean that gets into that gets into, you know, sort of when Doyle's looking over what he's written and thinking, how do I explain this? Well, there was somebody,
Who
and
murdered the chauffeur in
you know,
that
we
big
don't
sleep?
go into who it was because that would require another character.
Yeah,
So, and it also leaves us open as Sherlockians to be able to look at it and say, well, it was Moriarty, obviously.
yeah. Moriarty's behind this. So, um, he dies in the last chapter here, chapter 7, the conclusion. Holmes goes and does the whole like, this is how I did everything, you
Right,
know, and explains the trick, right? I mean,
right,
it reveals his method and explains the trick. And he says a couple interesting things, and this is the kind of big setup for the rest of for them what will become later Sherlock Holmes stories. And he talks to Watson about um, what is out of common is usually a guide rather than a hindrance. That when you find something unusual in a case, that helps you put it together. And that he also reasons backwards. He says there are 50 who can reason synthetically for one who can reason analytically. And I had to look up, like, I'm thinking, like, what do you mean by synthetic? Well, I look it up and it's that it's a philosophical term, and synthetic thinking for Holmes would be progressive, moving forward. Like this happens and then this happens, so you can reason what will happen next. And that's synthetic
right.
reasoning. The OED says proceeding from causes or general principles to consequences or particular instances. So Holmes contrasts this with analytical reasoning, which for him is starting at the end and then working backwards. I mean, I think his method seems to have a bit of both, you know, that he does synthetic reasoning during when he's observing and figuring out things, but then to piece it all together, he does it all backwards, which is interesting in a kind of meta moment. That's the key to writing mystery stories anyway, is that you have to figure out the end and then kind of work
Right.
it backwards.
Yeah.
So in order to get in order to get it all right.
Right.
And then at the very end, we get the Watson says, it's wonderful, you know, how Holmes has done this. He says, your merit should be publicly recognized. You should publish an account. If you won't, I will for you. And I love how Doyle also plays the game in a sense. I said this last week, how he kind of he even has Holmes talk about other fictional detectives as if they're
Right.
kind of real. And now within the story that we're reading, Watson is telling this, I'm going to write this story. And of course, we're
Well,
reading.
I mean, it's fantastic because what it does at the end of the book is bring the characters of the book alive in a way to the reader,
Yeah.
which is unusual because now suddenly they get to the end of the book and they hear the narrator promising the protagonist that this is going to be made available so people will realize how brilliant he is. And
Yeah.
the other thing that it does, even though there's no indication that Doyle at this point was thinking of continuing on with this character at all. What it does then is to say it also sets up the not only the relationship between Holmes and Watson, but the relationship between Holmes and Scotland Yard.
Yeah.
Because in that last moment, he says, "This is what they say."
Yeah. And the newspaper gives them
And
the
the newspaper gives it's Scotland Yard has leaked the story to the newspapers saying, well, Jefferson Hope was captured in the rooms of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who shows some talent and may one day be a great detective like Lestrade, you know.
Yeah.
All that. So he says, "This is what I do. This is what I get for all of my work. Is praise for these idiots." You know.
And then Watson at the end, and Holmes says that's the result of all our study in Scarlet to get them a testimonial, the inspectors.
Yeah.
Never mind, I answered. I have all the facts in my journal, and the public shall know them. In the meantime, you must make yourself contented by the consciousness of success, like the Roman miser. I won't read the Latin. I'll just give you the translation. The public hiss at me, but I cheer myself when in my own house I contemplate the coins in my strong box.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's the greatest.
It doesn't fit well. Like
It doesn't really. It
Doyle's
doesn't.
looking for a great Latin quote. He does the same thing in Sign of Four, the next one, but yeah.
Yeah, he does it. He does it in a few. There are several books where stories where he will say, some quote from George Sand or
But
some.
it's the idea that Holmes is like should be content with what he can get, not with what the public can praise him for.
Right.
And, you know. And the story ends. Any closing comment there for this then? I mean, this is, not intended to be a series, but this is the first introduction that this readership has, and it sells well. That the annual sold out.
Yeah. And he had sold the copyright, unfortunately, for £25, so he
Mhm.
never saw another penny
Yeah.
from it after that.
As then they put it published in book versions in both the
Right.
UK and the US. The UK version, the was illustrated by Doyle's father, which has even weirder illustrations of Sherlock with a beard. And
No, it's alarming. I mean, it's really a strange thing. But you could do a whole chapter on that. Charles Doyle. But I guess the biggest thing, we were at a memorial service last night for Susan Rice here in New York, and one of the speakers was somebody a neighbor who was referring to the fact that Susan had given her the 2-volume Doubleday edition of the complete Sherlock Holmes, and she admitted she'd never gotten through studying Scarlet, and everybody laughed because everybody's been there. That as brilliant as that opening story is, when you get to the Land of the Saints, people tend to sort of put the brakes on and go, but I encourage people to read it, not because it's good, because it isn't, but because it's part of something that was being done very deliberately, that was very much of its time,
Mhm.
and is interesting from that standpoint. And there is a way of approaching it that I think you can find it educational and enjoyable, as long as you don't really think that this is anywhere near as good as what has come before, and actually what would come later. Because I think we haven't gotten to it, of course, but the Valley of Fear does the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Only much more effectively.
Yeah.
So it's of its time. And I'll tell you something else. Zane Grey, if you read Riders of the Purple Sage, has a lot of qualities in it that have to have been influenced by this book. And that was written in 1914. And it is not a, it's a more interesting book because the main character is a woman, and an interesting woman.
You think Riders of the Purple Sage, right?
Riders of the Purple Sage, yeah. And but it shows the degree to which this kind of thing was still influential on popular fiction as late as World War I. So there you are.
All righty. Well, Sherlockians, thank you for joining us for episode 2 of Sherlock Mondays. Curtis, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you again. I think you're up for the Redheaded League in October.
I'll be there.
That's a great one too, right? That'll be exciting. Coming up next week, everyone, we'll start the search for the great Agra treasure. as long as Holmes can stay off the cocaine and Watson can stop ogling their new client, Mary Morstan. The sign of 4 likes
drugs and rock and roll.
Yeah, the sign of 4, like studying Scarlet, is also a novella. So we'll be doing it in 2 parts. Part 1 will be chapters 1 to 7, and that's what we'll talk about next week. And I will be joined by the fabulous Monica Schmidt, a psychoanalyst in her own right, who then, can talk all about Holmes and doing his 7% solution of cocaine. That'll be a lot of fun. Thank you to the sponsor of Sherlock Mondays, Lisa Washington. We couldn't do these shows without the generous support of our patrons. You can support the Rosenbach through donation. Your support helps us create more programs like this and also care for our collections. You could also become a member. Membership gives you early access and discounts to programs and courses. You can find out more about how to become a member or donate at our website, rosenbach.org. Again, let me remind you to subscribe to our channel, like these videos. If you're listening to the podcast, leave us a review. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library, where the game is a book. Thanks, Curtis.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.